Okay, Gothic literature is a modern genre that usually has strange, mysterious, dark settings. This is true for Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Most of our action takes place at night. The Picture of Dorian Gray, again, is very similar. And Rossetti's Goblin Market. Much of what takes place in that poem takes place at dusk and dawn. There are usually violent differences in power, and its stories are full of constraint, entrapment, and forced actions. We see this quite a bit as well in Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde as Dr. Jekyll struggles with his inner identity. And of course, we see that same struggle in The Picture of Dorian Gray. We see a more physical struggle in, like, say, examples of like Dracula. And it often focuses on terror, the feeling of dread and anticipation that precedes the horrifying experience, rather than horror, that feeling of revulsion that usually follows a frightening experience. So this is not the type of genre, typically anyway, where you see a lot of gratuitous violence. In fact, it's a lot of sort of the lead up to what might be happening that Gothic literature focuses on, those terrifying moments, that terror that precedes the act that is really scary. Oftentimes the scary act takes place relatively quickly, and then all of this lead up is what the authors are more concerned with. Gothic literature makes readers alert to the possibility of things beyond their everyday lives and understanding. And again, it really brings those ideas of science and religion together and sort of forces the reader to think outside of the box a bit. So the four main ideas that we're going to talk about are dehumanization, double brain theory, the criminal brain, and degeneration. These are concepts that we'll see in these novels that we're reading in this epic poem. So dehumanization, or the mad or quote-unquote bad scientists. So sometimes they're not mad, like insane or crazy. Rather, they're just bad. They're not doing science the way they should. And Victorians in particular felt, as this scientific discipline was burgeoning, that science should not be a solitary activity, that you should be out in public and sharing your science, and that any science that happens behind closed doors is maybe has intentions that are not so good. And so we'll definitely see that within these two works that we're reading. So Frances Power Cobbe was an anti-vivisectionist, and she started this society called the Victorian Street Society. And they work very hard to educate the public about what science and what these sort of pre-surgeons were doing at the time. Because again, remember, this is at the beginning of this movement. Scientists were really trying to get their arms around what science could do and what it couldn't do. And so in 1876, she worked along with her group to pass the Anti-Vivisectionist Act. And in 1889, Cobbe condemned scientists who think of the brain, which holds all the wondrous instincts and reasonings of the dog and the ape, as a lump of gray matter to be scooped out and broken up, to note what happens after its mutilation. So she really felt that scientists weren't interested in the humanity that was going on, and they were too much concerned with the science. She particularly deplored the treatment of Professor Ferrier's, David Ferrier's monkeys, whose initial brain surgeries were followed by hours, days, weeks of misery before the victim dies. In fact, these vivisectionists were doing all sorts of cruel, horrible experiments. And not because, for the most part, not because they were horrible, cruel people, but they were so focused on the science, and they were really lacking that humanity, that thing that we struggle for even today, really. So we are going to see a mad or bad scientist in Dr. Jekyll. We're going to see a mad or a bad scientist in Dorian Gray. And the second theory here we're going to talk about is double brain theory, and the third, the criminal brain. So these two theories are linked. The double brain theory began much earlier, and the criminal brain comes much later. So the double brain theory in the beginning of the 19th century, this is Franz Joseph Gall. Gall taught that everyone has two perfectly formed brains, each of which can substitute for the other in cases of unilateral brain injury. So we have this right brain and we have this left brain, and that we can ultimately choose if we want to use our left brain or if we want to use our right brain. He did not see them as working together, where the individual things that we do in our lives pull from both the left and the right side, which we know is the case today. In fact, in the past, he thought, well, you either use this left brain or you use this right brain. Each hemisphere, each part of these brains, it at least was potentially capable of generating a soul of its own, capable of independent will and consciousness. So you can imagine that if this idea was true, that we all have the capability of being two people, and that we have this capability of two possible souls within us, and that depending on how we use our time and use our lives, that we could be nurturing one of these brains over the other. Gall had managed to convince the scientific community once and for all that the brain was the organ of the mind, a previously controversial suggestion. So they thought all sorts of things, that maybe our soul was located in our heart. Maybe our soul was located in the lungs. Maybe it was located in the seat of the body. And of course, the brain was also being mulled over. Well, Franz Joseph Gall really said, look, it's the brain, the soul is there, and people, especially scientists, the scientific community, started to go in that direction. The left hemisphere, thereafter, became linked to civilization, rationality, and so-called higher cerebral functions. The right hemisphere should embody the opposite qualities then: impulsivity, savagery, animality, madness. So artists, writers, anybody living on the fringe of society, they would have been seen as indulging this right hemisphere brain, and ultimately they are more likely to be more impulsive, more savage, more animal, and of course the possibility of madness, versus those left hemisphere thinkers, those rational thinkers. So this made them very easily labelable, and scientists sort of grasped onto this and thought perhaps this was a way of identifying problematic people in society, and maybe even criminals in society. We'll definitely see this whole idea of the double brain theory in Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. The criminal brain comes around then in the latter half of the 19th century, and Cesar Lombroso is responsible for this. So he takes these ideas proposed by Franz Joseph Gall and he takes them further. He was influenced by misunderstandings of Darwin, in which criminals are viewed as throwbacks to early phases of evolution, these atavisms. You're going to see that word in Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, a process of degeneration. So he believed that if you could evolve, as Darwin suggested, then perhaps you could devolve, and that criminals perhaps had devolved to these lesser stages of evolution, these atavisms. He considered insanity a milder form of regression, and genius to be a mixture of the evolution of positive qualities with degeneration and madness. So Dr. Jekyll in this novel would have been seen as someone who was struggling with degeneration, struggling with this criminal brain. Lombroso said, giants of intellect pay the penalty for their intellectual power with degeneration and madness, and in them signs of degeneration are perhaps more frequent than they are in the insane. So amazingly, he said, it's not, we need to look at those people who are far more intellectual and be skeptical of them. At the sight of that skull, it seemed to all of a sudden light up as a vast plain under a flaming sky. It's like he looked at this skull, and he was just like Franz Joseph Gall, looking at skulls and noticing that these skulls have slightly different shapes, and that perhaps certain skull types, certain shapes, are more representational of these atavisms, these throwbacks of evolution. So down here you'll see that the idea of enormous jaws, high cheekbones, prominent superciliar arteries, arches, excuse me, solitary lines in the palms, extreme size of the orbits, that's the eyes, handle-shaped or sessile ears found in criminals, savages, and apes, insensibility to pain, extreme acute sight, tattooing, excessive idleness, love of orgies, irresistible craving for evil for its own sake. These are things that Cesar Lombroso linked to the shape of your face, of your skull, of your jaw, the shape of your overall skeletal skull. And so again, we're going to see this in Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. We're going to see this in Dorian Gray. The last one that we need to talk about just briefly is degeneration. Max Nordau proposed this in his book Degeneration, and he applied it to Oscar Wilde specifically. And again, this is like, degenerates are not always criminals, they're anarchists, they're pronounced lunatics, they are often authors and artists. And again, remember that degeneration is just where you indulge those parts of yourself that are seedier, shadier, that are not your public persona. And that if you do that too often, that ultimately that will lead you down this path towards degeneration, which is the opposite of evolution. So if we have that possibility to evolve, Max Nordau says degeneration takes us backwards, and we have that possibility of devolving. So these are the four main theories that we're going to see throughout our readings of Gothic literature. If you have any questions, let me know, and I will be leaving you feedback in relation to these concepts on our discussions and in our essays, etc. Okay?